Good evening. I'm Thane Rosenbaum. I'm the creative director of the Forum on Life, Culture, and Society at Touro College. And welcome to the FOLCS Conversation Series. Tonight, our conversation is immigration, COVID-19, and the 2020 election. Very important topic coming up for 2020 and thereafter. And immigration is always on everyone's mind, but they don't really know much about it. And tonight, in an hour and a half, you're gonna know everything you ever needed to know. As you know, that's the folk style. Never leave here, but without being much, much smarter. We have a special three guests who are legal practitioners and experts on immigration law, immigration policy, and immigration politics. First, Sanjay Sethi, who is the co-managing partner and founder of the law firm of Sethi Mazaheri. We have Victoria Neilson, who is the managing attorney, executive director of the Catholic Legal Immigration Network. You gotta love this, her acronym. You ready? Catholic Legal Immigration Network. It's CLINIC. It's just perfect. And Negar Mortazavi, of course. Sorry, Negar, I very apologize for that. Negar Mortazavi, who is an attorney at Berry Appleman Leiden. It's an international law firm, deals in in all sorts of asylum questions and questions dealing with visas. If you're watching us on Facebook Live, welcome. The audience continues to grow at each of our events, and so happy to have you. Please, if you can, find some time, go to folks.org and sign up for our email list, so that way we can advise you in advance of these events, and you don't have to only check on Facebook. We'll send you notice. And of course, if you have a question for our guests, you can leave it on the Q&A box. And I haven't said a word yet, as you know, I've been doing all the talking so far, because I know how dynamic, smart, brilliant, and charismatic they are. You might want to hire one of these people or seek their legal advice. So at the end of an hour and a half, at some point, if you want to write to us at folks.org, we'll always put you in touch with Sanjay, Victoria, and Negar. All three of you, welcome. Welcome to this conversation series a week before this election. You know, asylum has been on, asylum and immigration issues have been on everyone's mind for 4 years. Before we get into the politics and the legal structure of what many believe to be a broken and in some ways now lethal immigration system, I thought maybe we can start off basically. Oh, and I forgot also to mention, if you're taking this for CLE credit, go to the chat box. It's not too late to sign up and register for it. We're offering 3 CLE credits, so go to the chat box. You can do that now or do that at the end. I thought maybe Victoria, you would start off and just explain very briefly, what is the difference between asylum? We hear terms of art, removal proceedings. We hear terms of art called cancellation. People use that word. We know something's called deportation. If you can just sort of briefly just give us sort of the terms of art so we know the knowledge. Everyone thought they understood immigration just by the word asylum, but it's much more complicated than that.
Sure. So first I want to say I'm not the executive director of CLINIC. I'm a managing attorney in the Defending Vulnerable Populations program. I have to say that so my ED doesn't kill me. So asylum is in the news a lot, and with good reason. Asylum is very similar to when you hear the word refugee and you see, people in refugee camps and in various parts of the world. Basically, asylum is a special humanitarian route for people to secure protection in the United States. So if somebody is fleeing their country because they're afraid they will be killed, beaten, assaulted, raped, we have very strict rules that require our government to allow people to make applications to remain in the United States. There are different ways to apply for asylum. If someone's physically present in the United States, they can send an application in to U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, or people can be in, you said the word removal and deportation. Those are really synonyms. I think deportation is kind of the more common colloquial word. Removal proceedings is more the lawyer word because that's the word that appears in the immigration law. But basically, if somebody has either been caught at the border, been caught in the interior, and maybe they were driving without a license, they can be put into removal proceedings, meaning that their case is in front of an immigration judge. And at that point, there are various defenses that they can claim in court to try to stay in the United States. One of them is to seek asylum if they fear going back to their country of origin. Another one, which you mentioned, cancellation of removal, it's also humanitarian. It's for people who've been in the United States for a long time, at least 10 years, and have very close U.S. citizen or lawful permanent resident relatives who would suffer exceptional and extremely unusual hardship if they were removed. So I think we're going to have a wide-ranging talk about the immigration system.
No, that's fine. That was very helpful.
Humanitarian.
Very, very helpful. We'll get more direct, we'll get more specific about each of those categories at some point, but I just wanted to sort of lay the general foundations for most people who just really don't know these terms of art. Negar, maybe if you can help us, and Sanjay, certainly feel free to jump in. Can you explain the various visa options there are? Because we hear that all the time. We know there's something called the student visa, and but we've heard there are work visas, and there's something called an investment visas, right? So can you explain those? You might even want to give us what those names are, right? There's one that's an H-1B, just something brief that gives people a sense of the categories.
Sure. I think under this administration, we're hearing the terminology being tossed around legal immigration. And what the administration repeatedly refers to is there are these legal avenues and procedures carved out for people to either come here as in sort of different capacities. People come on F1 visa, which is for students, on an H-1B visa, which is for specialty workers, meaning that you must at least have a bachelor's degree or its equivalent to be able to perform in a sort of a professional occupation. There are researchers, there are scientists, there are investors, as you said. EB-5 has also been repeatedly in the news because the president's family is in the construction business. So there are a lot of EB-5 investments, and there was a lot of conversation about the amount that people should invest. So a lot of foreigners will come in and invest about $500,000. They put their money at risk, and in return, you get a green card. So there is, for example, E2s, which are not permanent, but those are also investor categories. There are E3s for Australians. There is H1B1s for Chileans and Singaporeans. And some of them have 2-year terms, some of them have 3-year terms. H1B visa is 2 3-year term visas. So they give you a very specific window. And I think depending on which category you're going under, your duration of stay will be limited by the provisions of that category.
You're saying even countries themselves have specific visa numbers. I don't think I even understood that. So you're saying that sometimes even the work visa itself could come under different categories based on where you're from. Okay, that's very helpful to know. And of course, combining both ideas that you and Victoria just said, when we hear the word overstay, right? I've heard that term of art. Overstay, I assume, means that you came here legally through some method and even obtained some kind of early visa that had, as you would say, varying degrees of duration, and then you just don't leave, right? And at that point, you become undocumented illegal. One question I would ask, Sanjay, maybe you can answer to this,
sure.
Is the overstay, since someone has already been here legally and they overstay, for not just the purposes of the Trump administration, but generally speaking, are they in a better category than someone who just showed up here and never even attempted, who basically came on vacation and never left, came to visit a relative and never left? I assume that happens too, and they had at no point attempted to be legal. From the perspective of how we look at them, or more importantly, how the legal system looks at them, are they given a higher level of priority in the event that they are subject to some removal proceeding?
Well, generally speaking, yes. And not to give a lorely answer though, but it does depend on the personal circumstances. Once you come in on a visa, after 6 months after the visa expires, then you actually accrue what's called unlawful presence. So for the first 6 months, you've just overstayed your visa. In certain classifications, you can overstay and still obtain status through other means, in particular types of visas that apply to the specific circumstances. For example, if you're on an F visa, you'll have 60 days to overstay and then figure out your situation afterwards. But if you've gone over 6 months, many Americans hear about individuals who come in and overstay their visa by 20, 30 years. They come in on a travel visa. There are more options and there are distinctions when compared to somebody who crossed the border. So if you came 20 years ago on a travel visa and you marry a US citizen, you can adjust status and get a green card without issue. There can be complicating factors if there's a prior
Wait, that
criminal
was,
history or
Sanjay, sorry, 20 years ago?
it could
Or
be
even-
30
even
years
today?
ago, it could be 40 years ago, it could be 1 year ago. You can adjust status if you're married
Right.
to a US citizen,
Right.
or if your child is over the age of 21, they can apply for you to adjust status. I don't want to paint it with too broad a stroke, but that does cover a lot of the immigrants in that
But the
situation.
question is then, if you don't marry somebody, but you just decide, I want to stay, I just don't want to be illegally and overstay, because someone told me, I watched the FOLCS conversation and I learned there's something called overstay. I don't want anyone to ever say the word overstay associated with my name. So is there a way prior to the Trump administration, that a person who just is in that 6 months category can go to one of the three of you and say, help me stay legally? Would that have been a problem 5 years ago? Like, is this something that is now something that no one would consider? They would say, look, there's no way anyone's going to let me stay. I couldn't even get in here the first time.
Generally
Was there a
speaking-
period of time that this would have, you described something that we all know of, right? You marry an American citizen. I'm saying, forget that. Let's something more complicated. You don't marry American citizen. You just want to stay.
So when you come into the country, you come under a status. The only way to get a different status is to do one of two applications, to do a change of status to a different non-immigrant visa or an adjustment of status to a green card. But you have to be in status. Once you're out of status, you cannot do a change of status or adjustment of status application. That was the case 5 years ago. That was the case 10 years ago. It doesn't mean that there aren't options. If somebody has a fear of persecution in their home country, they can apply for asylum within 1 year of entry, or even after if there's a change in circumstances. If they've been a victim of domestic violence, there's several visas that are available, or a victim of a crime. There's the U visa. If you're a victim of trafficking, there's a T visa. If you're a witness to a crime and you were helpful in the prosecution, I've had a client who actually testified against a cartel. There's an S visa. They're not given out freely, but it's another option. So there
Wait,
are
so the S
niche
visa, so just to be clear, the S visa went to a client of yours who had overstayed, right?
Yeah.
He had overstayed, but then this is one of those exception categories where you do overstay when at that point you've lost your pathway to a legal, the two other options, applying for a green card, right? But there are other avenues for staying, and you just listed a number of them. And these are all people.
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, can I jump in? Yeah, so I think what Sanjay's differentiating, there's sort of what we might call the ordinary path to permanent residence, which is generally through family-based immigration or employment. And you have to be here lawfully, as Sanjay was saying, to change your status or adjust to get a green card. There's an it would be easier with a visual. There's sort of the general rules and then the exception. So one exception, as we've talked about, is if you marry a US citizen, as long as you entered lawfully, your unlawful presence is forgiven. Then there's this whole other category of humanitarian status, which includes asylum and the visas that Sanjay was talking about. And for those humanitarian visas, based on being a crime victim, based on being a domestic violence survivor, based on persecution, how you entered doesn't matter. So
Right, the overstay is no longer an
whether, right, for those categories, it doesn't matter whether you are here legally or not. It doesn't matter whether you entered with inspection or not. But I think that, and the starting point of this question was sort of overstay versus something else. And in general, the something else is less about how long you've overstayed and more about whether you initially entered lawfully or whether you initially entered by crossing the border, because the U.S. immigration law places a lot of weight on whether that first time that you came into the United States, you were inspected by border protection or whether you were not. And just one other point, and I'll let my colleagues chime in. On this particular issue of sort of, well, who gets to adjust status or change status, I wouldn't say that President Trump has changed a lot on that issue. There are many, many things we'll talk about where he has changed a lot. One thing to remember is that the Immigration and Nationality Act, which was last overhauled in 1996, is horrifically anti-immigrant, right? And that was passed when President Clinton was president. He signed that law. And what we've seen more than anything under the Trump administration is that he's enforcing that statute to its most robust and fullest extent. But a lot of what's really horrible that's happening now was in the statute, and no administration, Democrat or Republican before, had really pushed the boundaries of that law.
Very good distinction. Good, very helpful to hear. All right, let's talk about President Trump. Let's talk about COVID. I was reading, so President Trump actually, is this possible? 400 policy decisions over 4 years, 400. We'll get to some of the highlight ones or low light ones. But that there actually were 400 policy decisions, some that became much better known, but is that even possible in 4 years? I mean, is that really the number?
It sounds low, honestly.
Okay. All right. So let's get to why he was even able to do this. Okay. Let's just talk, because I want this to be also somewhat philosophical. I want people to walk away from this and really get a deeper sense of what we're talking about. And by the way, I want you to explain like what you really think when you're talking about immigration. What is it that you believe in it? What is it from your sense, what it means to be an American and how immigration plays into that? So we know about the Make America Great hats, right? We know about building a wall as a chant, threat to the homeland, national emergencies. These are the words that we've heard before even the last election during the primaries. So we would argue that, well, it was nativistic or xenophobic or scapegoating, and sort of laid a groundwork for what Victoria is saying, right? That in fact, laws that were already in place but never implemented or enforced were actually enforced in ways that no one had ever imagined before. But I'm wondering, on one level, first of all, did it affect the way Americans even feel about legal immigration? Or is this really, did that get mixed up? In other words, that became just an anti-immigrant sensibility that we saw in the country? Or was it really about the undocumented? Because when you're talking about, the kinds of languages that we heard with Make America Great Again, it's not clear whether even being an immigrant lawfully is something that we weren't actually questioning in the last 4 years.
Well, I think it's broadly anti-immigrant, because if you look at the restrictions, I mean, putting aside the restrictions on asylum seekers and refugees, the recent suspension of the H-1B, the F visas, the L-1 visas, the J visas, the travel ban, the skyrocketing denial rates on many forms of visas, and then even recently the public charge rule, where the administration is going to try to deny a visa where an applicant doesn't meet an income requirement. So if a wife applies for her husband and is destitute, that application under the public charge rule could be denied. But if they're extremely wealthy, it very well will be accepted.
And by the way, Sanjay, let me just interrupt you for a moment, because we may forget this. This is one area of immigration where the new Supreme Court Justice, Amy Coney Barrett, has ruled when she was on the court. I don't know if the three of you, I think Victoria's shaking her, she knows what I'm talking about. In fact, when people are thinking, well, what is she, she's only on the court for a very short time. She actually took a very strong position on the public charge rule, and she actually believes in the public charge rule. So here's something that's a very important point. So anyway, go back to where you were finishing, because I think most people don't know what that meant. And most people don't realize that that was an area that the new Supreme Court Justice felt strongly about. Go ahead.
So, what I was just saying is that a lot of people are looking at this on both sides through the lens of what's happening at the border, what's happening with the population in the country that's been undocumented, the 12 million plus that are undocumented in the United States. And sometimes what's lost in this are actually the restrictions to legal immigration, which to me indicates a broader issue and a general attitude towards immigrants rather than a specific type of immigrant.
So why is it, unless I'm missing something, why is it that the public hasn't heard enough, in my view, of that, in fact, what you just described, a decimation? Now, maybe you could argue, well, that's because it's COVID-19. Some of it, I'm sure, is justified on COVID-19. But you're describing lawful mechanisms for visas that we've always recognized as benefiting the United States that have been reduced, limited, curtailed in significant ways in favor of thinking about immigrants as rapists and murderers, right? That in fact, that's the narrative. I hate to use that word narrative, but that's the story that we're hearing. And we're not actually hearing, yeah, but look what's happening on the other side, the thing that everyone said they actually believe in, legal immigration. How did we miss that part of the story? What's happened that we're not making that argument more strongly?
I'll take this one. I think there are multiple sort of factors that play in here. I think on the one hand, I think Sanjay was saying with, for example, for H-1B workers, a lot of people, when you think about immigrants, you're not thinking about, sort of the legal mechanisms through which, like, it's a fancy, sexy word to use, legal immigration, but no one actually knows what that process is. What does it entail? What positions do these people take? What are the jobs that they are actually taking? So part of, for example, a lot of lawsuits that in the last, I think, week and a half, there were 2 lawsuits that were brought against the H-1B regulations that were recently proposed. And, the sort of the argument that the government is using is because of COVID-19, there is an emergency, there's a high rate of unemployment, and therefore we need to sort of make the definition of what is specialty worker a lot stricter, meaning less people are going to qualify for this, and that means more Americans are going to have jobs. But the statistics that they've been using are just completely flawed. For example, they use a number like the unemployment rate, for example, in the IT and like computer technology sector. And they say before March, it was this, now it's this. And they're basically saying there's a huge margin, but they're also including people who, for example, the service people, the janitors in the industry, they're not talking about the sort of the programmer or the consultant who's taking that job. So I think there's a lot of facts that are being sort of misrepresented. The numbers are not being represented accurately.
So wait, is the press, who's blowing that story? Because what you just said is crucial, and someone has not told that story, that we're collapsing different categories. And on top of collapsing it, we're treating them as if that's not even legal because no one knows what legal immigration is anyway. So we're not only explaining it, but then we're collapsing the difference. The reason this is important for you, Negar, my understanding is a huge part of your practice. You represent Google engineers. Like that's a big part of your job, right? And even President Trump has said, well, why would we want to get rid of people who could, invent stuff for Apple? Right? Why would we want biotech people to be thrown out of this country, right? And Negar would say, I know, there's my clients. So even if President Trump has made that argument, has he forgotten that argument? Or is he just saying that because it sounds good, but he doesn't want to confuse people? He just said, you know what, let's just pretend that all immigrants are bad.
I agree with that. And I think it depends on who is his audience, right? Who are you speaking to? And I think to simplify that matter, I think it makes a big difference as to how are you going to categorize this? And also it's not only him, there is the Stephen Millers and the people who are also in the background.
Well, what about the New York Times? What about the I would think the Wall Street Journal would be your friend in particular. Because if I was working in Wall Street Journal, I'd say Negar's clients, we cannot lose.
So if I could just jump in, I mean, I think that one of the problems is just like immigration fatigue, right? I mean, so we've had some stories that are so horrific, like the first Muslim ban, everybody was out on the streets protesting. And by the 3rd iteration, it's kind of like, oh, it's another Muslim ban, right? So when we have family separation and visuals of people in uniforms taking a baby from a parent, suddenly that's a front page story. But you yourself said there have been at least 400 changes. So a lot of what we've seen are these more technical changes that make enormous differences in the lives of, you know, a mother who can't be sponsored by her US citizen child anymore because she's too old to work, or maybe the Google engineer who's subject to new rules. There's just not enough room on the pages of the newspapers for every change that's happened, and people get tired of hearing about immigration.
And
Sanjay?
Following up on what Victoria said, I think scapegoating it's a really seductive argument, and it tends to drown out a lot of the fact-based arguments that take a little bit of time and nuance to understand. So if there's a shortage of data scientists and experts in artificial intelligence, and there's great value to bring in those workers because we can't supply them, we're not graduating them fast enough, that's maybe not as seductive an argument that, you know, as opposed to this person's taking your job. He's quite literally coming to this country and taking your job away. Or this person coming across the border is taking your home. There are these reductive arguments that worked very well for Trump, that he's not going to abandon right now, that tends to drown out some of the sensible, more technical arguments that maybe the American public should be exposed to more.
I mean, let's just get through this question because I think this part is important. I know you're not social scientists or moral philosophers, but let's just go for it for anyway. Just ask this question. You're right, I love the word you use, seductive, but what is that? Is it because we have an angry, jobless sector of America? You know, a certain anger that's related to joblessness, automation, industries that disappeared, and fear associated with that? Is it that we have, you know, we just have an ignorance, just a general ignorance, right? We just nothing personal. I just, you know, someone who just doesn't know anything much about a lot of things, and here's something they don't know something about as well on that list of ignorance. And the third, which you could make an argument, which I don't believe, because I don't think this is a white supremacist country. You know, I just don't buy that. We have white supremacists, but I don't think we're a white supremacist country. Some people would say, well, it's just really white supremacy. So, all right, Thane Rosenbaum has just said he doesn't believe it's the third, but it could be still an argument. Does anyone have any sense? Is it all three? About what is the source? I mean, you know, Donald Trump tapped into something that was real. And let me just give you one quick anecdote. In 2014, I'd have to ask our producers, I don't remember, 2014 or 2015, 2 years before the election, we had Jeb Bush as a guest on FOLCS. You can go on our website and look at it. You know why he was on? Well, he's a Spanish-speaking American. He's born in America, but he's Spanish-speaking. And he had just written a book on immigration. And he wanted to talk about the book on immigration, in which he was saying, hey, people don't come to this country to commit crimes. They come to this country for opportunity, right? And I remember thinking, you know, someone in the audience asked him, do you want to run for president? He made a joke, my mother said I'm not allowed to, or something like that. One Bush son is enough. As we know what happened. A year later, he was in the race. And a year later, what we thought was going to be the winning argument became the thing that actually drove Donald Trump to victory. So from my perspective at FOLCS, it's totally twisted, right? Because if you were in the audience that day with Jeb, you would think that's the winning argument for 2016, right? And look what happened. It was actually the worst thing he could have done. Is that was one he was riding on, among others. Of course, Trump was running on a wave. So can anyone, you know, jump in and say, well, here's what we think. It's complicated, but nobody want to touch this one.
I mean, I'll give it a try. I mean, I think that there are two different levels of what's happening, right? I think that Trump is masterful at riling up his base. So if he finds a phrase, whether it's her emails, lock her up, or build the wall, and that gets people chanting back at him, he's going to repeat that phrase, and he's not going to understand any of the subtleties. He doesn't have to. But he has people he's installed who do understand the subtleties, and I do think that Stephen Miller is a white supremacist, and whether or not the people who chant build the wall are consciously saying, oh yes, I like Stephen Miller because he's a white supremacist. I don't think they're making that connection, but I do think that the people who are putting through these 400 changes have understood that the Republican Party is doomed if you know, the sort of, after the Obama win, the sort of postmortem was the Republican Party is doomed unless we can bring more people of color into the party. And it seems like what has happened with the modern day Republican Party is they've riled up their shrinking, less educated, whiter base, and they're trying to remove other people from voting, whether that's by delaying citizenship applications for immigrants who are here, whether that's by preventing immigrants from coming here at all, or whether that's by suppressing voters in predominantly African-American parts of the country. I mean, that seems to me to be a systemic strategy, and to me, the anti-immigrant plan is part of that.
And a self-sabotaging strategy, right? Because we have what we now know to be an increasingly aging population. I forgot what, I wrote some statistic down, something like, you know, at some point in the year 2040, like, you know, most of the country is going to be over the age of 65 or something, like doubling the size of that population. We need an expanding workforce, right? We need everything that, you know, immigrants bring us. And yet that too, that story also, instead, we hear chants in Charlottesville that say Jews will not replace us. By the way, I finally realized what that meant, right? It wasn't about Jews per se. It was that Jews were being held responsible as cosmopolitans for bringing in immigrants who would then take away the jobs of the people who were marching, right? They were saying, you guys are into immigration, you Jews. And so that we don't want you to replace us with immigrants. So again, it's a self-sabotaging, and it's a part of the story that you have to go read and find, which to me is distressing, right? That people don't know. Negar, Sanjay, do you want to jump in and where a little of this, again, it's really a political question. It also is at heart, it's a question that touches the soul of America. So it's a big question, but it's one that I think I'd like to talk a little more about, because I have no idea how this happened. Because as I said, when Jeb was on our stage, it seemed like this was the winning argument. Here's the term of art I heard all the time. The immigration system was broken. Heard that all the time. 2014, everyone said it. It's broken. It needed, here's the word I heard, overhaul. Oh, these were the words. I heard this all the time. And when Jeb wrote a book and used all those words, I thought that's what the election would be about. It never occurred to me the election would be, and by the way, when Donald Trump early on was talking about immigrants as rapists and murderers, I remember laughing because I thought, oh my God, what an idiot. I mean, doesn't he understand that's the wrong argument in 2016? It shows you what I know about elections, but it is an interesting anecdote to try to understand why we are where we are today.
It really is a paradox. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to answer this question, but to highlight how much of a paradox it is, if you look at public polling on DACA, on legal immigration, on all these issues, there's broad public support for legal immigration. Even if you look at it from an economic standpoint, if you look at it from a social justice or moral standpoint, from a fiscally responsible standpoint, we're not going to just up and deport 12 million people. That's not happening. Fiscally, it's impossible. Logistically, it's impossible. In the face of all these arguments and public support, nevertheless, he pulled out a real nativist argument. And I agree with Victoria. I think these people are so far to the right that it's shocking to me that this argument was viable in our lifetime. I really didn't think it would be able to tap into so many people.
Yeah.
But it is an age-old thing that's worked. Scapegoating, I don't pretend to be a sociologist, but if we look back to Europe 100 years ago, scapegoating the immigrants was very effective in Central Europe and Eastern Europe, and even in Southeast Asia. So nobody had tried it in a while, and he did. and it worked. We'll see if it worked again, or if it will work again. But
do any of the three of you, since you're lawyers and you're involved in various aspects of immigration, do either of you personally or professionally believe that immigration, as long as it's legally implemented or applied for, should be unrestricted? Is anyone here of the view that, well, we have a lot of states in the United States that are not very populated, and as long as there's room for more people, you know, people forget the great immigrations of the 1880s, right? Right before World War I, right after World War II, right? Yes, in the 30s, there was, again, nativism, right? We all remember those, you know, Father Coughlin, Charles Lindbergh, we remember these stories. But we've had other periods in American history where people said, you know, the Statue of Liberty is up there for a reason. And it says, give me your poor for a reason. And there's a light, and that's why we do this. I'm just curious. I know there are people who get in fights at dinner parties about this. And they'll say things. So you mean to say you would just let anyone in unrestricted without limits? Do either of you have anything to say to that, both as lawyers, or how do you respond to people who question it one way or the other?
I mean, I think it would be a much harder argument to make to the American public at this point. You know, I think 100, 200 years ago, there was sort of endless land in the United States and a whole lot fewer people on the planet.
Yeah, but Victoria, everyone lived in the Lower East Side. So
yes, we can let everyone in, but they can't leave.
That was the weird part. You know, there were people trying to pay people. That's why we have Levi's jeans, because there were certain people who lived on the Upper West Side who we literally pushed them to go west. And that's how we have Neiman Marcus and Levi's jeans. People forget these little anecdotes. But yes, everyone still wanted to live in two cities.
I mean, to me, I think the fundamental bones of the U.S. immigration system make sense, that family unity is at the heart of the immigration system. We need robust humanitarian protections. We need employment-based visas that help our economy grow. And then there's the diversity visa system, which sort of brings in people from parts of the country that would be blocked out of the other immigration systems. I think that they need an overhaul. Please don't, I never thought I'd be sort of quoting Jeb Bush, but.
Well, no, he was quoting somebody else too.
I mean, I think it needs an overhaul. The system needs certainly a lot of changes to it. And I would, burn down the 1996 law and start from scratch. But
I don't know where you were in 96, Victoria, but in 96, did the immigration bar take a very strong public position that this was terrible, that this was a terrible law? Because I started practicing immigration law in 1997. So I was learning the law the sort of minute that the new law was being implemented. And my mentor, was kind of like, oh, we used to be able to do things this way, but now we have to do things this way. And it certainly was something that was very upsetting to the immigration bar, sure. COVID-19. So I've done some reading on this. The administration took the position that we need to seal the border, prevent certainly people from China, but from other places to enter the United States. Because this was a public health emergency. But I also read that the CDC provided statistics that said that actually it presented immigration or travel did not actually represent there was no public health reason for it. Can we talk a little about this? I mean, how pervasive was this? How significant was this for your own practices? What do you know about what the CDC said? Is this yet another example of the Trump administration having a problem with science?
So I think there are two bans that came out since March. One being the physical presence ban, meaning if you've spent within there's list of countries, Schengen area, China being included, North Korea, Iran, Brazil, that if you've been in those countries within the last 14 days prior to your entry to the US, you will be barred entry, or you will have to go quarantine in a third country for 14 days and then you can come. So that's one. There's another one that was sort of hinged upon the COVID-19 argument, but not per se on the health aspect of it, but rather on the economic aspect of it, which the presidential proclamation, I think it's 10052, barring the entry of L1 and H1B workers. So I think the really interesting factor in both of these proclamations were the fact that, and this, we actually saw this happening with the Muslim ban. He comes out with these grand proclamations. It's overarching, doesn't know how to implement it. There are no sort of specific implementation guidelines for CBP officers or consular officers. And then you get about 3-4 weeks, you get some guidance coming out, then they come out with exceptions. Or the exceptions are initially built in, but there is no definition as to who qualifies for them. And I think for both of these proclamations that were based on the COVID-19 argument, it was like, if you're going to help the US economic recovery, you're welcome. And if you are an H-1B worker with XYZ qualifications or an L1 multinational manager or specialized knowledge person, you get to come in if you qualify for certain categories. So at the end of the day, I don't think either of them make sense because they're not really, yes, they have limited the flow of, I guess, workers coming in and out. I've had people coming in from London who have gone to Mexico, stayed there for 14 days, then they entered. We have a lot of Chinese clients who are going to Cambodia, staying there for 14 days and flying directly. Or for example, yesterday, I was applying for an exception through the UK consulate for a client saying basically they can come to the US and they're helping the US economic recovery because they work for a big sort of e-commerce company. So there are all these different arguments that they're building in, and I don't think at the end of the day, they're really helping based on like the argument that the administration is putting forward. They're not really carrying that purpose forward.
I think that's the same experience we've had. I think the incompetence with which they've handled the entries kind of reflects how they've handled the pandemic itself. I'll give you an example. We have a client in Pakistan. Him and his wife both got into Wharton. The wife is a U.S. citizen and she applied for her husband for a green card. They've been waiting for 8 months for an interview. It's sitting at the consulate. We got a letter from the dean of Wharton. I mean, Trump went to school there. I guess it doesn't hold anything, but it made no difference. And Negar is very right to actually relate it to the travel ban, because I think they come up with these broad proclamations, but they don't know how to implement it. They give very little guidance to the State Department. When the travel ban went into effect, part of the reason it was found constitutional is it had this waiver carved in. But for a year, no State Department office had any idea how the waiver process worked. We would apply for a waiver, a husband and wife, if they're apart from each other, or if a parent is separated from their child, this waiver exists to get them together to overcome the travel ban. But for a year plus, none of them were processing through because there was very little guidance and, frankly, I think very little interest on the part of the administration, which shows you that they're not acting in very good faith, even when they're making these arguments in federal court that, it's not really a ban. We have this process that we've put together, or we're not shutting the embassies down. There are these exceptions we've carved in for essential workers, but in reality, it's quite hard.
So the visa applications, even for workforce related, especially when it comes to special workforce visas, even during COVID, those continued, but they're surely reduced. Is that still correct to say that COVID did actually reduce the number that we would normally have? Or was there just an exception made for certain categories of visas? Like the story about your two Wharton people sounds like, well, that, what is the reason why they can't come? So what in terms of numbers and absolute numbers, like I can't remember, is it that we saw that in the last 4 months, 15,000 various types of applications have been turned back? Or did I read also it's 150,000 people total when you look at the asylum over the period of the Trump administration who have been either deported or not permitted to enter the United States. I think that's the number. Am I correct about that?
So the 150,000, which I think is actually a higher number now, is a another category of sort of victims of the Trump's COVID response, and that's asylum seekers at the border. So
mostly the southern border.
The southern, right. I mean, the rule applies to the northern border and the southern border, but most people who have managed to make it to Canada would and are seeking asylum would rather seek asylum in Canada at this point than in the United States. In fact, the United States and Canada has a safe third country agreement that's been in effect for almost 20 years, which says, you know, because our systems are so similar, if one person gets to one country first, they have to apply for asylum there rather than the other country. And a federal court in Canada just determined that the United States is no longer a safe third country because our asylum system is so broken at this point. But so what's happening at the southern border is people who normally would be able to present themselves at a port of entry, or even if they cross the border and get caught, would have asylum claims, and it would have a very specific process that they have to go through to be able to seek asylum before an immigration judge, are being subject to what's called Article 42 expulsions, where they're just sent back to Mexico with no process whatsoever. And I mean, to me, this is very much what, you know, the Trump administration's goal has been all along, to just end asylum, to end any protections at the border. And, you know, Trump himself has said, you know, why do we put these people in immigration court? You know, no court, no proceedings, send them back. And boom, COVID-19 was like a giant gift to the Trump administration's immigration strategists, who can now say like, oh, public health, it's not our fault, even though, you know, every day, thousands and thousands of trucks come into the United States from Mexico, because that, you know, that's necessary commerce. So as a public health measure, it doesn't make a lot of sense.
So the term of art that we occasionally hear is the remain in Mexico portion of the, that's what that means.
No, that's different.
Okay, good. Explain that.
So starting in 2018, long before COVID, 2019, January 2019, the Trump administration decided that asylum seekers shouldn't have a right to enter the United States at all and wait in the United States, whether it's in a detention facility or after paying a bond and being released basically on bail. Instead, they would have to wait in Mexico for their hearings. And I mean, I'm happy to talk more about that.
Well, but is that, Victoria, and I don't know if Negar and Sanjay know much about this, I mean, I'm sure they do, because I remember there was one of these, I guess, of these presidential directives in which he said, well, it's like hop, skip, and a jump. If you've come to Mexico from two other countries or another country, and you could have sought asylum in an intervening country, you had an obligation to ask there before coming here. Do I have that right? And then what was that called, and what happened to that one? And you can almost see certain Americans saying, well, what's wrong with that? Why do you get to pass through 6 countries, of which if you're saying I'm a marked man or woman in my country, and in my country, I would be persecuted for sure, and I have a very real fear of persecution, but in Honduras, I don't know anybody. And so I guess I could live lovely in Honduras or Guatemala. So whatever happened to that? First of all, is that still in place? That challenged in court? Do you all in principle also? Do I have that right, by the way? Did I just make that up?
I'm happy to answer that, but I'm talking a lot. So if anyone else wants to jump in. And if not, then I'll answer.
Yeah, I'm just curious about, because I think most people don't know about this.
Right. So
it's interesting.
So that one is, I think, referred to as Asylum Ban 2.0, because there have been so many bans. And basically that was, Trump said that, or the administration said, if you pass through another country on the way to the United States, you must seek asylum in one of the countries you pass through and lose, or you can't win asylum in the United States. The problem is the majority of people traveling across the southern border to get to the United States are from the northern triangle of Central America, Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. So if you're traveling from El Salvador to the United States, you're traveling through Guatemala and Mexico, which are the top 5 asylum producing countries are those 3 Central American countries, Mexico and China. So 4 out of 5 of the most dangerous countries are the places where the United States is saying, oh, hey, why didn't you apply for asylum in one of the most dangerous countries where the exact transnational criminal organizations are operating instead of coming here? And it's absurd because people are afraid in those other countries, A, and B, countries like Guatemala don't have an operating asylum system at all. I think they have 7 asylum officers. So it's, you know, it's not an answer. It's just another way of pushing people away in a way that sort of looks like you could make an argument with a straight face in federal court, as Sanjay was saying. But when you really look a little deeper, it's clearly not designed to provide any kind of protection at all. It's just designed to prevent people with asylum claims from seeking asylum here.
Let me ask this question, and I have a feeling that Victoria will answer it as well, and then we'll move over to our other friends, because I don't know, maybe the other two know. I'm just curious, she made me think of something. So we know what our understanding of amnesty has historically been in the United States, and it's obviously gone through some modification over the last 4 years. But what does international law say about amnesty? I mean, is there a general principle globally about what amnesty is and how it should be applied? I'm assuming Poland certainly doesn't care about amnesty. 98% of the people there are Polish Catholics. They accepted none of the Syrian refugees. They figured it out. They're just saying, no, unless you're a Polish Catholic, we're not really interested in you living here. So I don't know if there's international law that says to Poland, well, no, that's not how it works. Is there a general principle about amnesty from a international law perspective?
Well, yeah, there's the 1967 protocol on the status of refugees. I mean, you know, I know you say international law and everybody's eyes roll, but we actually ratified it. And I think you can make the argument on all these asylum bans that they're not just illegal according to domestic law, but international law. But irrespective, it is a ratified treaty. We're obligated under international law. So, for example, you cannot, under that treaty, punish a refugee for their mode of entry into the country. And everything that has happened is totally violative of that. Now, I don't think that the argument before the Supreme Court is going to rest on the 1967 protocol. But there, you know, with refugee international legal protections, actually there's more meat on that compared to maybe some other areas of international law.
So just so that our audience gets a flavor of where some of this or all of this might be headed. So has been what, 3 cases to the Supreme Court in the last 3 years of the Trump administration. Am I right? The first one was the travel ban, which the Supreme Court upheld. And you could almost see why, right? It's got a post 9/11 look to it, right? If it's about national security, we don't second guess the administration. If President Trump says this is a danger to the homeland, we don't second guess it. On the other hand, the Roberts Court has turned back the last 2 cases, right? There was the one that dealt with introducing a citizenship question into the census, right? And the court basically ruled in favor against the administration's policy. And then, of course, this year was DACA, right? It was to dismantle DACA, and the Supreme Court said, well, you don't have a real good rational reason for doing so you can't. That didn't mean they can't come up with a better reason, but for now, they just said you can't. Now, my understanding now, there's 2 more cases that are headed to the Supreme Court right now. Now that Justice Barrett is on there, 2 more. There's the Build a Wall case, my understanding is going to the Supreme Court very soon. I know that, I'm not saying my understanding, I happen to also be the legal analyst for CBS News Radio, so this comes up in my life. But yes, the building wall about essentially the argument that you can use Department of Defense funds, and declare it a national emergency. That's on the southern border, and then there's this other one, right? The one about the Sooners coming up. This one about counting undocumented immigrants for census purposes and allocating congressional seats and federal funding. Those are 2 more. Do either of you have any sense of where this is all headed? By the way, if Joe Biden wins the election, I suspect some of this is just moot. It will go away because there's no case or controversy if the president just says we're not doing that anymore. So I'm just curious, can you, I know you're not academics, thank God, but do you have anything you want to say about what will essentially been 5 cases that went to the Supreme Court, major cases in the last 4 years?
I mean, I think it's interesting that under this administration, the Supreme Court has given the executive a lot of authority to do what he wants in immigration. Under Obama, the case that sought to expand DACA to, parents of children failed. So it's sort of a weird thing where you have an executive who's done so much damage in such a short amount of time that if we were to get a different president who was welcoming to immigrants, there's this weird tension where on the one hand, it doesn't seem right that the executive has so much power. And on the other hand, if an incoming pro-immigrant executive didn't wield the same kind of power and quickly, we would sort of never regain all the ground that we lost under this president. My personal opinion is that the Supreme Court has become so politicized that I would see the opinions going, that went for Trump going against Biden, basically. I mean, I just think it's not an impartial court at this point, and that, decisions that should be decided on principle, well, this is what the statute says, or this is what you have to do. I don't see that happening.
And the point that Victoria is really making is that, which has been one of the arguments, which is that if a president doesn't have the capacity to get Congress to pass the legislation that he or she wants, he or she could implement their own executive orders. And so that's really what, President Trump has been doing. He's just been issuing his own executive orders, which have been challenged in the courts. It's a way for presidents to sort of do an end around of Congress. Normally, you would think an overhaul of the immigration system would be acts of Congress. There'd be all kinds of immigration. There'd be a new immigration bill, just like Victoria said happened in '96, right? So you could have had something now that would have made Victoria really, really happy if they had passed such a piece of legislation. Instead, what she's really describing is, in the absence of legislative action, the president is just undertaking unilaterally the executive orders in each case. But what's interesting to me is he's only 1 for 3. He's only one for 3. We got 2 more coming up. That's even with a conservative court. Now, I understand that's why the conservatives are upset with Chief Justice Roberts. But I just want to say, I'm surprised that the Supreme Court, that is so conservative, actually only gave Donald Trump 1 of 3 victories. And the first one, to me, is predictable, because you can justify a lot in this country after 9/11 if you say that it's about terrorism. If you talk about Islamic extremism, you get a lot done. And so I suspect that's really what worked there. I don't know, Sanjay, Negar, you want to?
I think on the travel ban, what worked was that it was, number one, and it was repeatedly referred to in the decision as temporary. And then the other process was that there was a waiver, that it wasn't an absolute ban, that there was this procedure. And both of those haven't necessarily turned out the way the court would have thought. I mean, does anybody think that Trump's going to eliminate the travel ban if he's reelected? So is it temporary anymore? It sort of feels permanent to me.
Let's just get through some things that we hear, because we hear it as part of the chants. The statistics: criminality and immigration, any truth to it all, violent crimes, sex crimes. If you heard the president 4 years ago, he still says it. Are there even some numbers that justify anything so pejorative about immigrants being the cause of violent crimes?
I mean, I don't have the statistics at the tip of my tongue, but the statistics are that immigrants actually commit fewer crimes than US-born citizens. Of course, with a population of 12 million undocumented immigrants, and I don't know how many lawful immigrants, there will be some criminals among them, just as there are among people who are born here. So if you want to pull out one case of some horrific crime, you know, you can find those cases if that's who you want to parade in front of the public. But, you know, I think that the biggest threats to U.S. security at this point are from white supremacists, which our own intelligence communities have stated clearly.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, we're pretty violent on our own. We have violence built into our culture.
What I just did read new Trump rules, new regs for it to become ineligible for even an asylum application. If you have a fake ID, if you've been convicted of a drug possession, if you've had 2 DUI convictions or 1 that resulted in bodily harm or death, and if you've been convicted of domestic violence. I'm wondering whether that's actually going to affect anybody's asylum application. But it's, again, when I read those regs, I think, okay, so is that because there actually are people who will be denied, or are those regs intended to just prejudice immigrants because it just introduces the idea that asylum seekers have those categories, fake IDs, you know, drug possessions. Again, this is just, to me, it's just very loaded. That's why I want to know what do we know about. Now the tightening, it's clear, and maybe one of you can speak to this, that as we're getting closer to the election, the immigration, there's been more of a tightening of the immigration laws. Is that correct? Are we seeing that independent of COVID, or would you say, no, that's just COVID?
I mean, I would say one thing that we've seen, just, you know, we use the drinking from the fire hose metaphor in immigration, is I think as this administration has questioned whether there will be a second term or not, they have just thrown everything they have at the wall, like the wish list of the anti-immigrant hate groups have all been published through notices of proposed rulemaking. So that I don't think is COVID related at all. I think, you know, in the past 6 months, there've been, you know, probably 24 rulemakings that are like very, very substantive and would really change so much about the immigration law. And that one that you were just talking about with the asylum criminal issues was just published. That was sort of the tip of the iceberg. That one was initially proposed in December of 2019, but since then, it's been insane.
Yeah, it struck me when I read it. I went, whoa, that's serious. That if you're going to publish those new regs, you're really sending yet another statement. This is going to work. This is the ultimate dog whistle. Negar, green card naturalizations, as we get closer to the election, I heard that they have, I would say, come to a complete halt, but are curtailed, postponed. Even those kinds of, even what we talked about before, remember Sanjay kept throwing, well, if you marry someone, well, yeah, we all, right, that's the most conventional way we understand. There's even a movie called Green Card. I have a friend who was in it. But is it even true that what we thought, even the green card, the restrictions on them we're seeing imposed more as we get closer to the election?
I think what we're seeing, for example, for this month of October, like the fact that earlier we discussed the concept of public charge. I think in family-based categories, that has had a severe impact on people's eligibility for sponsoring their relatives, their parents, mothers, fathers, spouses, siblings. And because of that, especially on the sort of in our area of practice on corporate immigration, we've seen a huge number of visas becoming available for employment-based categories. So there is this sort of chain effect that is happening, that on one end, there are certain categories that are not moving forward, but on the other hand, there's a spillover of those availabilities coming into the employment base. So there is, you know, sort of this balance of, okay, in this area, we're not allowing people to get sponsored. We're not granting green cards. Interviews specifically during COVID, I think one thing we've also seen with the interview processes is because of public health reasons, some of them are being waived. So I think it's a complete mixed bag of what is the administration is actually doing. I think they're saying something on one end, and the impact can be sort of contradictory to what their intent was. And I think that has been one of the biggest challenges, I think, for practitioners specifically during, I think the past few months, is there are directives that have counter sort of effects, and they also work in contradiction to one another. So I think, yes, we have seen a lower number in one area, but a higher number becoming available in another. And it sort of makes you wonder as to what are you actually, like, what are you trying to achieve? But the publicity front of it is, yes, we are anti-immigrant. We are trying to crack down on immigration. But on the back end, there are just a variety of factors that are into play with different sort of impacts.
So what we've heard often in the last 4 years, and I was hoping that maybe we can clarify that, is family separation issues seem to come up in a number of ways. One is separating parents from children. So can we talk a little bit, is that only in the asylum case? I did read that the Trump administration, even Jeff Sessions, his first attorney general, said this was intended to deter future immigration, right? To say, if you're coming with your kid, be ready, because we're taking your kid away, and then you're going to have to fight it out in the courts when your child's not going to be with you. So how much of that do you know has been true? Is that, and also for people who make the argument, certainly Donald Trump supporters will say, well, some of this also started under the Obama administration. This isn't something, what do we know about that? Do we know that this is something that did have a predecessor administration? Obama administration did this. I don't even know if you want to address the cages question, whether children were thrown in cages, but I know there's an enormous amount of confusion about it, and I would like the FOLCS audience to know just slightly more about it. And then the other family separation issue is if a child is a citizen of the United States and wants to reunite with a parent who lives elsewhere, right? Those are another examples where ordinarily there would be a naturalization pathway for the parents, which I also think, I'm told, has been disrupted somewhat. Even though you say, well, why would you want to do that? The child is an American citizen and naturalized. So there may be other family separation issues, but those are, parents and children, and then little children being taken away.
Well, I can address the asylum context, and I think my colleagues could maybe talk about the changes in family immigration. So first, on the Obama question, immigration advocates had a lot of issues with the Obama administration on a number of areas, and one of which was family detention, because he did detain parents and children together, and we fought that in the courts, and mostly were able to get that time frame that children could be detained limited to 20 days, but he did not have a specific policy of removing children from their parents with no intent or goal of ever reuniting them again. That was new and horrific. In addition to that sort of headline policy that the Trump administration had, another sort of more technocratic way that they implemented family separation as a policy in asylum is what we were talking about before, this asylum ban 2.0, which said if you pass through another country, you're not eligible for asylum. And the way to try to get around the international law obligations is that the administration said, well, you could still apply for this lesser form of relief, something called withholding of removal, which allows you to stay in the United States, but with no pathway to citizenship, no path, you have a removal order, you can work, that's it. And there's no ability to sponsor family members. So what could happen there is, if a mother was the victim of persecution, but her 3-year-old child who's with her wasn't, like is 3 years old, can't even articulate a claim, the mother might be able to win withholding and the child wouldn't. So, then you have a situation where a child would be deported and a mother might get status here. Or, if the mother came by herself and got status, she would have no ability to ever sponsor her children again, no ability to ever travel outside the United States to even visit with her children again. So there's sort of more subtle ways that family separation has been central to this administration's response to the humanitarian crisis at the border.
Negar, Sanjay, your experiences with family separation?
Yeah,
Negar,
just to briefly follow up on what Victoria was saying. I do think there is an underlying motivation here, which is to make the process of seeking asylum as odious as possible. And, Victoria was talking about the asylum ban 2.0 and some of the subsequent measures by the government. They want to restrict work authorizations significantly. So right now, if you're applying for asylum affirmatively, it could take 3, 4, 5 years to get your hearing. And in the interim, you're able to work. But they want to limit that so significantly and make the experience so difficult, so unpleasant, whether it's separating your child, taking your ability to work away, taking your ability to gain asylum and give you an alternative relief withholding of removal, which is extremely restrictive, makes the whole experience so unpleasant. I think their motivation is to make it such a terrible experience that people don't seek it. On the subject of family separation in the context of green cards, I mean, again, there's supposed to be exceptions carved in, but I'll give you another example. There was the terrible plane crash in Iran, and we had a client who lost her sister, and she was extremely close to her sister. And her parents, all they wanted to do was come and visit their child so they can grieve together, but they were travel banned. So the family was separated. But she couldn't leave either because she was seeking asylum. And if she left the country, it was going to risk her ability to come back in and get asylum in the United States. And I think this sort of pervades a lot of the consular process where there's these restrictions in place where family unification doesn't happen. There's supposed to be a process for exceptions carved in, but they're not really moving at all.
Negar?
And I think to piggyback off of what Sanjay was saying, and it's not just the regulations and the proclamations and like things that are specifically geared towards family separation, but all the other different anti-immigration regulations that are being sort of introduced and putting into effect are inevitably having that impact. We have a lot of clients whose kids are US citizens, they're from backlog countries such as China and India. Parents have been here for 15 years and they lose their work status and they have to leave within 60 days of losing their status. We had a lot of families who, because of COVID, became unemployed. They couldn't find another employment. They had to depart. So their children who were 17, 16 were left here with relatives. Parents had to leave the country. Or, sort of as a personal anecdote, like my family, my cousin had sponsored my aunt and uncle for a green card. They got stuck in the first Muslim ban. Finally, after a year and a half, exactly like Sanjay was saying, they finally said, this is how you get a waiver. A waiver was approved, then COVID hit, and then their immigrant visa expired. Now consulates are closed. So it's this, saga of like 3 years of trying to get reunited, but you're not able to do it because there's so many different, they may not be directly sort of, on the sort of the letter of the law is not about family separation, but inevitably the impact is we're going to make this immigration process so difficult that no one wants to do it. We've had a lot of clients who have actually moved out. Like last week, I had a call with a client who said, you know what, I just don't want to do this anymore. Like try your best. If it doesn't work, I'm going to move to Hong Kong, or another person moved to Canada. So we are seeing a lot of people actually giving up and saying, if this country doesn't want me, it's okay. Like I will leave, and I'd rather just not go through this very difficult process.
Do we know if we ever use cages for children?
So
was that just something that was thrown out to just?
No, I mean, there are it's not a key. Yeah, I mean, when people are processed at the border, the first place they go is a Customs and Border Protection holding area. And they look like cages. And I don't believe that children, I think that there are families that have been placed in those holding cells.
All together.
My administration and the Trump administration. I mean, no one should be placed in something that looks like a cage. And
yeah, well, when you hear the word, it's what you associate. So that's why I wanted to hear.
I mean, it's not like
please tell me we didn't do this.
I mean, you can see the picture, and I mean, I think Trump, focused on that in the debate, that there was a photograph that people were circulating saying that Trump had done it, and that photograph came from the Obama administration era. It shouldn't happen under any administration.
Do you know which category gets to me? I know they're all horrible, right? All these denials but But the one about the number that apparently was 4,000 Iraqis every year we set aside for some Afghanis, but mostly Iraqis, for citizens of Iraq who had assisted the American military or assisted the members of the press or assisted NGOs, I'm not sure, but I think it's especially for people who helped the American military in any capacity, that they would create 4,000 slots a year for those people. By the way, remember this, all of this has to do with largely because of the upheaval of those countries from American invasion. So on top of everything else, their country's not the same as it was, you know, in part because the United States invaded with the Allies for in some cases, good reasons, in some cases not. But the idea that this was always a concession, apparently the Trump administration has limited that to 16 people or something ridiculous, under 100 out of 4,000 people. And I thought, God, what a betrayal. You know, think of it, two entities that have been betrayed. The Kurds have been betrayed by the Trump administration, and I'm part of an organization that is a human rights group that focuses on that betrayal. Justice for Kurds, by the way, you can look that up. And this thing to me that we had set aside 4,000 slots a year, and that we have people that are stuck, and they're marked men and women, right? Everybody knows that they are collaborators, right? I mean, this is just, you know, who knows if they'll live long enough to ever even come here. Another philosophical question, and then we'll go to the questions. Sorry to ask the tough ones, but you know, that's what the FOLCS audience looks for. So I don't even know how to ask this. It's so hard. We used to think of ourselves as a country that was a big melting pot. Those were words that we used to say about when I was a boy in school. We talked about the United States as being a melting pot and that everyone assimilated through the melting pot. We know that the Syrian refugee crisis all throughout Europe has been, to a large extent, a failure of absorption, a failure of assimilation, a failure of absorption, a failure of, you know, liberal democracies that are not being in any way, have any real true coherence with, you know, systems of government and, you know, political Islam and Sharia law, all sorts of things that make those things incompatible. So we have no-go zones in France. You have a lot of politics of contention around, well, taking in for humanitarian purposes, refugees. So we have sort of an experience that's there that we can look at as a model. Here, I don't see the same thing, right? I don't know whether we can actually claim we've had an absorption problem. At the same time, we don't really have a market melting pot philosophy anymore. That's politically incorrect. I just want you to know. I can tell you that. It's uncool in today's culture to use those words. It violates the spirit of the politics of identity. It violates a lot of sort of an intersectional woke universe. You're in the immigration business. You're trying to help clients become legally, have illegal status in the United States, in a country that I think is going through change about what our relationship is with immigrants anymore and what we expect of them. You know, one last anecdote. You know, I wrote about this many years ago. All movies, all movies have the same thing in common. Fiddler on the Roof, My Big Fat Wedding, Bend It Like Beckham. They're all the same. At the end of the movie, we're asking the immigrant to change. just stop what you're doing. Stop your traditions. Stop, be us, be like us. Those movies are identical. They're the exact same movie. But I don't know whether you can even make those movies anymore because you're not allowed to talk like that. So I don't know if this is something you've thought about. I think about it all the time. And I think it is a challenge for people in your business. This is not going to go away. Trust me. One of these days you'll call me up and go, remember that last question you said? You know, I kind of see more of that now. What do you think?
It's something I experienced. You know, I don't know if I can speak as an immigration lawyer on this, but, you know, my parents came in the late 60s and we did, you know, integrate, but it was over time. The Indian community of Northern New Jersey very much sustained us for a very long time. And if you hear the same story from every Indian, it's always the same. My dad came with $8. It's because that's all they were allowed to come with actually at the time. So
You're saying this is the same family saga for everybody in northern New Jersey.
yeah, exactly. So when I first went to my first,
I'm pretty sure it's my friend Preet Bharara has the same story. I'm just saying.
Is it? Yeah. And Preet is from New Jersey.
I know. I'm going to say, I could call Preet now and say, guess what Sanjay just said? You have the same story, $8?
But it is a process. I mean, I don't think it's so binary that, you stay insulated in your community or you immediately integrate. It's a challenge for an immigrant to come to the country and to get a job, to integrate into any new community. It's very understandable.
But there's but the difference is a desire to. A desire to seems to me very different from, that seems, I don't know if I'm wading into more politically incorrect territory, but that sounds different.
Well, I mean, what I've seen from clients I've worked with is that the parents often give up a lot to give their children a better life in the United States. And the children generally Americanize, however you want to define that, more easily than parents. So, I mean, I see, even in asylum seeking families where, the cases have been lagging for several years, and these teenagers who came here with, 3 years ago fleeing, they're teenage, there's, no difference between one teenager and another. So, I mean, I also do think that at least part of the American myth, whether it's true or not, which I think is different from European mythology, is that there is this sort of land of opportunity and social mobility. And, I think there are questions about how accurate that is at this point, but I think that myth plays into the notion that, anyone can come here with $8 and their son might be a lawyer,
Negar, so when I look at you, you look like you're not old enough to know any of this.
I am. I immigrated here when I was 13. So I think, you all sort of speaking from a personal, stance, the challenge has been you're consistently told you have to be a model immigrant. I think immigrants have this pressure of, a lot of times people would tell me oh, you've done really well in life. And there was no option. Your parents give up everything. And the expectation of society is if you as an immigrant fall short of the standard that you must, hold yourself up to, then you are 10 times more of a failure than your American counterpart. So you have 10 times more to prove. You have to work harder. So I think those things do play hand in hand with, yes, we do as a society force immigrants to assimilate and become more American. And part of that, I think, is regurgitating this idea of the American dream. I personally don't think such thing exists. I think it's a myth. I think it's a way for us to make people work harder. And we actually abuse a lot of people by repeating this myth where there are these glass ceilings where, for example, coming out of law school, I wouldn't get an interview because people would say what kind of a name is that? So you see those challenges despite what you have.
I'm really sorry I blew the last name in the introduction. No, really, I feel even worse right now. Sorry.
No, not at all. But I think, I completely agree with your statement that we do force people to become more of what we expect. We have an idea of what an immigrant is like. We have an idea of what they should be like. And I think the society does put that pressure on immigrants to assimilate and to become this ideal of, chasing the American dream.
Well, I'll tell you, I'm happy with all three of your answers because it makes me feel more hopeful. What I don't want to see is what we are seeing in Europe. We had Ayaan Hirsi Ali here a number of years ago. And, I thought it was very depressing what she was describing about her experience in Holland. It was very depressing to hear. And I think she was worried that the United States was headed this way. And by the way, Negar, I don't want to get into this discussion because I've been writing about it lately. The word hard work now is becoming a problematic term. Maybe we'll do a FOLCS event about it. But in an increasingly illiberal society, the word merit and hard work, not okay. There are certain communities in the United States that think that is by itself racist, flat out racist. So either your family is, I'm just saying, I see a tension. I hope it never results in anything other than just a tension, because, I do think that it may not be a myth, but there is a magic here that this country would be nowhere without immigrants. We wouldn't be a country. It's so clear that everything that's good that's happened in the United States, whatever industry it is, it's because some immigrants were here. It is just flat out. How anyone could deny that is just absurd. Let's take some questions. Thank you for engaging in that, what I would call classic folks discussion that was a little complicated, but yet we got through it well and in the spirit of friendship yet, which is good too. Here's a question from someone I know who actually taught me everything I know about immigration law, my friend David Breeden. He says, I am an immigration practitioner, and I would like to know your thoughts on Title 42, and if there are any reliefs from this order. I don't know anything what that means. Can you explain what Title 42 is?
Yeah, I can tackle that briefly because I was talking about before. That's the expulsions at the border due to COVID. So unlike migrant protection protocols where people sit in Mexico to wait for their hearings in the United States, Article 42 expulsions, the United States literally is sending people back to Mexico or their home country, and that's it. We wipe our hands of them. It's horrible. There is a challenge to that rule. The ACLU brought in the summer. There hasn't been a finding that the 42 expulsions are illegal, so I'm not sure what stage that case is at.
Okay. Annie Wang asks, as Congress has failed to pass major immigration legislation during the past two administrations, and remember, we've heard from Victoria earlier about the 1996 law. So I don't know whether there has been any other major immigration law since 1996, but Annie Wang is pointing out that the last two administrations certainly haven't. Doesn't it, meaning the executive branch, bear some of the responsibility, Congress rather, sorry, doesn't the legislative branch bear some of the responsibility for all of the anti-immigrant executive orders and proclamations that the White House has issued, which says basically, if you're not going to do your job, you're going to get a president who's going to be much more active and proactive. And remember, my memory about DACA is that President Obama created DACA through the proclamation because he wasn't getting anywhere with Congress. He wanted to see overhaul, and he thought that some DACA provision should be part of it, and they wouldn't play ball. So he created it. So what does anyone want to take a point of, hey, that's what separation of powers means, and Congress sat on its rights, and this is what Trump did, and this is what Obama did, and this is why people are responding the way they respond.
I mean, I think George W. Bush tried to give it a shot. He actually proposed an immigration reform bill with the Gang of 12, and his own party bucked him on it.
Did he have the right idea? But would it, whatever they had in mind, would have made Victoria happier?
No, but it would have been better than what we have right now, in the sense that maybe there would have been a pathway for the 12 million undocumented workers. It would not have solved the problems of IRA from 1996. I mean, there's just so many problems with that. I don't think any proposed legislation has actually even tackled some of the inequities that have come out of that legislation. But maybe wither the filibuster, something will happen.
True.
I mean, I would just add, I think one of the real problems specifically in immigration is that the statute gives so much power to the Attorney General, like the Department of Justice runs the immigration courts. There's nothing in the statute that even says there needs to be an immigration court. That's all set up by regulations by the Attorney General, and basically almost, the Attorney General can do almost anything to change immigration, which is why we've seen this flurry of regulations this summer. And that was a decision Congress made in delegating all that authority to the Attorney General, and something that I would hope that Congress is regretting at this point.
Okay. The last question, and we'll say goodnight to our friends. This comes from Francine Scanlon, and she says, in the last several months, the Trump campaign has no longer mentioned the immigration issue. Why did a topic that was so politically radioactive go radio silent? Just got to love that sentence, don't you think? Good way to go, Francine. Thank you. She wants to know the answer. I don't know. I haven't thought about that. Do we actually agree with Francine that, in fact, the administration went radio silent?
Maybe publicly, but what Victoria was saying earlier, I mean, it is staggering the amount of stuff that's happened in the last 2 months. And I think Victoria was exactly right. I mean, they're just going down the right-wing wish list and trying to get it all in before. I mean, we don't know what's obviously going to happen in a week. And maybe it's a deliberate strategy to go radio silent while, coming up with some pretty horrifying regulations that, if the American public really truly understood, could possibly be horrified about.
Okay. All right. Some closing remarks. First of all, once again, if you want to get in touch with Sanjay or Victoria or Negar, send a note to folks.org. I think we're at info@folks.org. Go to our website and we'll put you in touch with them. You might have questions. You might be seeking legal representation. It's clear these are three extremely seasoned, extremely knowledgeable. And I would say that I could think in an hour and a half, you could recognize that there's passion in them. They're not just billing time. They appear to be people who are not just sincere lawyers, but will want to get you the best result and the best outcome for humanitarian purposes. You can always email us at info@folks.org if you'd like to get in touch with everyone. So it's info@folks.org. Before we say goodnight, let me just thank the audience for staying with us for an hour and a half. We usually end at an hour. Absolutely. I'm really a big believer in an hour. We went an extra half hour because for CLE credits, you need an hour and a half. So we went in another half hour. We do it occasionally in these situations. Happy to do it. Hope that you were able to stay with us the whole time because I thought it was interesting. As you know, there's what you're seeing there is the folks.org/donate. There's also a way to text us a donation. Yes, we are a nonprofit. Yes, as you know, we haven't charged throughout the pandemic. We see this as a public service, part of our mission as a nonprofit. We're very proud of it, and we're extremely proud of the programs we've produced all throughout the summer. If you go to folks.org and go to past events, and you see what we've done on Zoom, I have to say, it's some of the best stuff we've ever done. I want to say, Negar, when you were talking about when you got here at 13, I was thinking about one of our earlier guests, the young actress, I think she's young. She's certainly your age, Margarita Leviva, a Russian actress who she was with us for our Conversations in Essential Cinema discussion, where we talked about the film Dr. Zhivago. She came to this country from Russia when she was 9 or 10 years old, and she moved to Brooklyn. And like Sanjay's northern New Jersey, she lived in a Brooklyn enclave of Russian Jews, and now she's a movie star. And she said a lot of interesting things, how important it was to learn English, and her parents didn't exactly want to even live in the heart of Russian Brooklyn. They wanted to live a little outside of it so that they could see more of outside. And to me, these are all classic American stories. And I'm proud that I'm a first-generation American. My parents were Holocaust survivors, and it's important to me to think of myself as, first-generation American. And I'm proud of that. Yes, maligning immigrants never worked for me emotionally. And I can imagine how, that must feel for someone who is, in any way, in such profound ways, to be made feel unwelcome. Even at Folks, we like to think of ourselves as a tent, and you're all welcome. Soon, come on Zoom, and you're welcome inside our tent. Sanjay, Victoria, Negar, you're all such incredibly charming guests and wonderful guests. We have one upcoming event, November 17th. We're doing something called Heroes of COVID. We have some very special people who have launched various COVID-related initiatives, and it'll be a very interesting COVID discussion because these are all initiatives that came about only through this pandemic. So I want to thank the audience. Thanks for being with us. Thanks Sanjay, Victoria, Negar. You can always come back with us. Sanjay is one of our board members, so we always have Sanjay with us. That's important to us. If you want to get in touch with Sanjay, Victoria, Negar, please write to us. And we hope to see you on November 17th. I'm Thane Rosenbaum for FOLCS. Good night.
Good night.